The letter was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from my morning walk, tucked between a flyer from the grocery store and what looked like a hydro bill. I almost didn't open it. I was 67 years old, retired after 31 years as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company out of Hamilton, Ontario. And the one thing retirement had taught me was that nothing good ever comes in an envelope with a lender's logo on it. But this one had my name on it, my full legal name. And the return address was a mortgage broker I had never heard of, operating out of a strip mall in Mississauga. I set down my coffee, sat in the chair by the window, the one my wife used to read in before she passed, and I opened it. It was a notice of arrears, 90 days past due on a home equity line of credit for $148,000 secured against my property in Burlington. The account had been opened 14 months earlier. The monthly payments had been missed for 3 consecutive months. If the balance was not resolved, foreclosure proceedings would begin. I read it 3 times. My hands didn't shake. I think I was too confused for that. I had no memory of opening any line of credit. I had never signed anything with this company. I had paid off my mortgage in full 6 years ago, and the house, a modest 2-story on a quiet street near the escarpment, was mine outright. I had always been careful with money. My whole life I had been careful. I turned the letter over, as if there might be some explanation printed on the back. There wasn't. The name on the account was mine. The property address was mine, and the signature on file, I would later learn, looked enough like mine to get past the desk review. I knew immediately, in the way you know things you don't want to know, that my daughter's husband had something to do with this. Let me tell you about my daughter first, because she deserves more than a footnote in this story. She was my youngest. After her mother died of a cardiac event 8 years ago, it was just the 2 of us for a while, and we were close in the way that people become close after shared loss. She had a good head on her shoulders. She had gone to Guelph for environmental science, worked for a few years at a conservation authority outside of Kitchener. She was thoughtful and careful, and I was proud of her in ways I never found the right words for. Then she met her husband. He was a few years older than her, self-described entrepreneur, always working on something. When I first met him, he was flipping properties. Then he was doing some kind of import business out of Brampton. Then he had a partner, and they were opening a restaurant. Nothing ever seemed to quite land, but he talked about everything like it was already successful. And for a long time, my daughter seemed to believe him. Maybe she needed to. I tried to stay out of it. My own father used to say that the worst thing you can do to a marriage is stand too close to it. So I kept my distance. I came for Sunday dinners when I was invited. I helped them move into their townhouse in Oakville. I lent them $3,000 once when they were short for rent, which I later accepted I was never getting back. But I kept my mouth shut because she was happy. Or at least she seemed happy, and I told myself that was enough. The arrears letter changed everything. I did not call my daughter that day. I sat with the letter for a long time, and then I drove to a branch of my regular bank on New Street, and I asked to speak to someone in lending, a young woman named, well, it doesn't matter what her name was. She was patient with me and kind. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. She pulled up what she was allowed to pull up, and what she found confirmed that a home equity line of credit had been registered against my property through a third-party broker. The paperwork listed my name, my date of birth, my address, and a copy of what purported to be a government-issued photo ID. She told me to contact a lawyer and to file a report with the police. I drove home and sat in the kitchen again until it was dark outside. I want to be honest about what I felt because I think people assume that when something like this happens, you feel rage or panic or some cinematic version of betrayal. What I actually felt was a deep, quiet tiredness. Like a door had closed somewhere inside me. I had spent my adult life building things. A career, a home, a family after my wife got sick. A retirement that was modest but mine. And now someone had reached into all of that without asking, without hesitation, without what seemed like a single moment of concern for what it would mean for me. And I was almost certain I knew who. I called my daughter the next morning. I asked if she and her husband could come for dinner on Friday. She said yes right away. Cheerful, no hesitation. I asked if everything was all right with them, just casually, the way a father does. She said things were a little tight, but they were fine. I said I'd make the roast she liked. For the next 4 days, I did not sit still. I contacted a lawyer who specializes in real estate fraud, a referral from a colleague who had dealt with a title dispute years ago. The lawyer was direct and practical in the way I appreciated. She told me that what had been described sounded like mortgage fraud using identity impersonation, which is a serious criminal offense under the Criminal Code of Canada. She advised me to file a report with the Hamilton Police Service, contact the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and place a fraud alert through Equifax and TransUnion. She also recommended that I request a full copy of the application documents from the broker, which we could compel through proper channels. I did all of it. I kept copies of everything in a manila envelope in the cabinet where I used to keep my wife's medical records, because old habits are hard to break, and that cabinet locks. Friday came. My daughter arrived first, a few minutes before her husband. She brought a bottle of wine and hugged me, longer than usual, which I noticed. Her husband came in with his jacket over his arm and his phone in his hand, and shook my hand the way he always did, firm enough to mean something, which I had always found slightly performative. He sat down at the table like a man who had no particular reason to be nervous. I fed them. We talked about small things, her job, the neighbor's renovation, whether the Leafs had any real hope this year. I watched him. He ate well. He laughed at his own jokes. He did not look like a man who had forged his father-in-law's signature to secure $148,000 against a house he didn't own. After dinner, when my daughter was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, I took out the arrears letter and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. I watched his face. There was about 3 seconds where nothing happened. Then he said, "I was going to talk to you about that." I said, "Were you?" He said it was a short-term thing. He said the restaurant had needed a capital injection and his business partner had backed out at the last minute, and he had known he could turn it around in 6 months. He just needed the bridge. He said he had always intended to make the payments. He said my name was already on the property. It wasn't like he was taking anything from me, just using an asset that was sitting there. I let him talk. He went on for quite a while. When he stopped, I said, "You used my name without my knowledge or my consent. You forged documentation to obtain credit against my home. That's fraud." He said, "Come on. You don't need to make this into something it isn't. We're family." I heard my daughter come to the kitchen doorway behind me. She had stopped rinsing. He said, "You've got more than enough. You've got the pension. You've got the RRSP. You don't even have a mortgage. You weren't using that equity. I was going to pay it back before you ever needed to think about it. I did this for us. For her, for the life we're building. You want her to have a good life, don't you?" I had been waiting for something like that. The pivot. The moment where my objection to being defrauded became evidence of my selfishness. I had thought about it all week, actually. About how that sentence would be constructed. About the way love gets weaponized by people who understand that a parent's instinct to protect their child can be turned against the parent. I looked at my daughter. She was standing very still in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands. I said, "I want to know if you knew." She didn't answer right away, and that pause was one of the hardest things I have ever had to sit through. Then she said, "He told me it was a private loan from someone he knew. I didn't ask enough questions." Her voice was different than it had been at the beginning of the evening. Quieter. Her husband said, "We can sort this out between us. There's no reason to involve anyone else. Give me 60 days and I'll have the payments current." I said, "The police report has already been filed." The room went very still. He said, "You called the police on your own family." I said, "You committed fraud against your own family." He stood up from the table. He said some things I won't repeat in detail. About my age, about my stubbornness, about how I had never really supported them, never really treated him like a son, and how this was exactly the kind of coldness that had driven a wedge between me and my daughter for years. He said I had been sitting on that house for 6 years doing nothing with it, and he had tried to do something for his family, and I was going to destroy everything over paperwork. My daughter said his name, once quietly. He stopped. She said, "You told me it was a private loan." He said, "It's more complicated then." She said, "You told me it was a private loan from your cousin." He left that night without saying anything else. He got into his car and he drove away, and she stood in my hallway, not quite knowing what to do with herself, and I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table until past midnight. That was the beginning of a very difficult few months. But I want to be clear about what happened next, because the story doesn't end in a kitchen. The investigation moved slowly, the way these things do. The broker who had processed the application was cooperative once investigators started asking questions. He had relied on documentation that had been submitted electronically, and while there were processes he should have followed more carefully, the forgery had been competent enough to get through. My son-in-law had, it turned out, used a scanned copy of my ID that he'd obtained years earlier when I had asked him to mail a package on my behalf. He had kept it. He had used it. My lawyer advised me clearly on what remedies were available. The line of credit had been used to fund what remained of the restaurant venture, which had by then collapsed anyway, and to cover personal expenses, including, I later learned, a leased vehicle in my daughter's name that she had believed was legitimately financed, and several $1,000s in furniture and appliances. The money was largely gone. Through the civil proceedings, we were able to place a judgment against him and register it against any future assets. The property fraud charges proceeded through the criminal system. He eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of fraud under the criminal code and was sentenced to 18 months of conditional sentence, house arrest, community service, restitution payments. The restitution was set at $87,000 to be paid in monthly installments over several years. Whether I will see all of it, I don't know. My lawyer says to be realistic. The lender, for their part, had some exposure as well. My lawyer negotiated a resolution in which the fraudulent line of credit was discharged and the lien against my property was removed. I did not end up losing my house. I want to say that plainly because I know that when you're reading something like this, you worry about that. I did not lose my house, but I want to tell you about something else, because the legal part is only part of the story. About 6 weeks into all of this, I got a call from a woman who introduced herself as the mother of another man who had been defrauded in a similar way. Her son's former business partner had used her property as collateral without consent. Slightly different mechanism, same fundamental betrayal. She had found my name through a community legal clinic where we had both been referred for support. She said she had been feeling quite alone with it and wondered if I might be willing to talk. We talked for almost 2 hours. Over the following weeks, through that clinic and through a referral to a seniors legal advocacy organization in the region, I connected with several other people who had experienced property fraud or financial abuse by family members. Some of them were older, some were my age. One was a man in his late 50s whose adult son had taken out a secured line of credit using similar methods. We were not an army. We were just people who had been embarrassed and frightened and who discovered that talking to each other made the embarrassment smaller. When my son-in-law appeared in court, some of us were there, not to perform anything, just to be present, to be visible. The judge, and I think this mattered, was able to see that this was not an isolated domestic dispute. It was a pattern of conduct with real human cost. He looked at me once across the courtroom. I don't know what he expected to see. I hope he found something more useful than what I gave him, which was nothing at all. My daughter filed for divorce 4 months after that Friday dinner. It was her decision, made in her own time, and I have tried to respect that it belonged to her and not to me. She is living now in a rental in Waterdown, not far from me. She comes for dinner most Sundays. Last month she helped me clean out the shed where I had been storing her mother's garden tools for 8 years, and we planned some things along the fence line, and somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, I realized I hadn't thought about the fraud case for several days in a row. I am 67 years old. I have a house that is mine, a pension from 31 years of honest work, and a daughter who is slowly finding her footing again. I have a cabinet that still locks and a kitchen window that faces east and a chair I have stopped trying to stop sitting in. I think about what my son-in-law said that night, about the equity just sitting there, about me not using it as though value only counts if someone is extracting it. I spent a lot of years building things quietly and carefully and without much fanfare, and I admit there were moments during all of this when I doubted whether that had been worth anything, whether careful, quiet people just end up as easy targets. But I look at what he has now, the conditional sentence, the restitution order, the record, the divorce, the failed business, the bridges burned, and I think I built something that is still standing. He built something too. and now he has to live in it. That is enough for me. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, not looking for drama, just trying to understand what it actually cost and what it was worth. The thing about what my son-in-law did is that it wasn't complicated. He found a gap. My trust, my ID left with him carelessly years ago, my name on a property I'd worked 3 decades to own outright, and he walked through it. People who do things like that are counting on the fact that love makes you slow, that a father won't move quickly against his own family, that the instinct to protect your daughter will stall your instinct to protect yourself. He wasn't wrong to calculate that. He was wrong to think the stall would last forever. I think about the kind of man I tried to be over 67 years. Not a perfect one, but one who paid what he owed, showed up when it was inconvenient, built things slowly, because slow things tend to last. My wife used to say I was stubborn about honesty the way some people are stubborn about money. She meant it as a small criticism. I took it as a compliment. Because the truth is, integrity isn't something you perform on the days when it's easy. It's what you fall back on when everything else has been stripped away, when someone has taken your name and your signature and tried to make them into something you never agreed to be. What I learned from all of this, and I don't say it lightly, is that clarity is a form of protection. Not just legal clarity, knowing your rights, keeping your documents, understanding what's registered against your property, but the clarity that comes from knowing your own values well enough that no one can use them against you. My son-in-law tried to tell me that reporting him was selfish, that I was choosing money over family. That framing only works if you're confused about what you actually stand for. I wasn't confused. Not that night, and not in the months that followed. My daughter showed something that night that I will carry with me for a long time. When she said, quietly, that she had been told it was a private loan from a cousin, she was telling the truth in a moment when lying would have been much easier. That took something. It cost her, and it was the beginning of the path that led her out of a marriage that had been slowly hollowing her out for years. She did not fold under the pressure of her husband's anger. She held. That is not a small thing. And then there was the work of getting through it, the lawyer appointments, the police report, the months of waiting, the courtroom. None of that was easy or quick or satisfying in the moment. It required showing up for every step of a process that didn't care about my feelings, only about the evidence. That kind of persistence, the quiet, unglamorous kind, is what actually produces results. Not rage, not public confrontation, just steady, documented, consistent effort in the right direction. He built something too, as I said at the end. A conditional sentence, a restitution order, a record, a divorce. Those are also the results of cause and effect, the same law that governs everything else. You do not get to extract value from people's lives without cost. The accounting just doesn't always happen on the schedule you'd prefer. My house is still standing. My daughter comes for dinner. The garden along the fence line is starting to fill in. That is what it looks like when the right things hold.